It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Approximately 60,000 Vermonters are collectively carrying as much as $155 million in old medical debt they're struggling to pay and providers are having difficulty collecting. State Treasurer Mike Pieciak is pushing a program to make a big chunk of that debt go away. He's recommending spending $1 million in already allocated funds to pay down as much as $100 million of that old debt that's owed by folks with low and moderate incomes. The benefits, he said, could be huge. Medical debt is the number one reason Americans file for bankruptcy. Some people that owe money avoid getting the care they need, and the psychological burden that debt carries is incalculable. In this edition of 802 News, Pieciak explains how the debt relief program would work and who would be eligible. In addition, he discussed concerns about the state's financial situation in light of recent efforts by the Trump administration to cut federal spending. Our program is sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. We'll begin our discussion in a moment. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. I've been reading up a little bit on this whole idea of medical debt, and I, obviously knew it was a problem. I didn't realize how extensive and deep a problem it was.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, here in Vermont, we know that we have really high healthcare costs. Depending on how you measure it, we're usually at the top, if not the number one in terms of cost. So whenever you have a state with really high medical costs that has a median income that isn't also at the highest levels, healthcare is going to have a disproportionate percentage of your income. And the gaps that exist in the healthcare system mean that people end up often in medical debt as a result. So I think that helps explain why Vermont has so much medical debt. We estimate that there's $155 million in outstanding medical debt in total. Over 60,000 people impacted by medical debt in Vermont. In Vermont, it's about 1 in 10 adults. That's sort of around the national average, but
a little higher actually.
Yeah, a little higher. Yeah. So it's I think again explained by the fact that healthcare costs in Vermont are higher than average, and again some of the highest in the country, resulting in people that need care ending up in medical debt.
The national numbers were staggering. 220 billion was a number I saw, and that's even, I think, a couple of years old.
Yeah, exactly right. So it's a pervasive issue across the country. It's not unique to Vermont. It's not unique to our healthcare system. There are gaps in the healthcare system broadly across the country. But what is, I think, unique to Vermont is that we do have higher costs of healthcare, and that results in an above average amount of medical debt for Vermonters. So trying to find ways to relieve that and provide an impact is something that we're seeking out to do.
Who are we talking about?
In terms of the individuals with medical debt, it really can, I would say on the one hand, it can be anybody, right? We're all sort of one event away from having a medical crisis or ending up in medical debt. But in terms of the program that we're looking at establishing, we'd be focusing on moderate and low-income Vermonters, basically 400% of the federal poverty line and below, or people that have extraordinarily high amounts of medical debt, so 5% or more of their annual income. So that's sort of the group that we'd be looking to help with our medical debt relief program. But really anybody can have medical debt. Again, if you're so many Vermonters are living paycheck to paycheck without a lot of income set aside, a lot of savings set aside. So when you do have a medical bill, it can set you back quite a bit. And the other thing to think about, Vermont has a really high insurance rate. We're pretty well insured. But a general trend that's been happening over the last 5 years is this sort of underinsured concept. So people have really big deductibles, they have copays. So even when you're fully insured and you go to the doctor, you have a medical emergency, you might have a few $1,000s that you have to come up with to pay for those services. And like I mentioned, a lot of Vermonters don't have that set aside for an emergency.
That's where I was going with the question, because it seems as though there are an awful lot of people that have insurance. I mean, we actually have a pretty high rate of insurance, but it's this underinsured and these out-of-pockets. I mean, I know personally speaking, the plans for the past 5-6 years I've had just increasingly more and more costs out of your pocket.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, we have one of the highest insurance rates in the country, so we can look at that and be happy about it. But to your point, it's a way of basically putting the cost onto the premium payer when you're sort of having these deductibles. It's a way of bringing the premiums down, which in some ways makes the insurance more affordable because they're not picking up as much of the risk. But the end result is that, more of that risk is falling to your pocket. It's falling to you as the individual consumer of healthcare services to come up with the $5,000 in some cases deductible to meet your medical needs.
I want to get back to the program in a minute, but one of the big trends seems to be going on across the country and with states is to not have medical debt be put on your credit rating.
Yeah.
Where are we at in Vermont with that?
Yeah, so our proposal, there's two parts to it. One is a relief proposal, and the other would be a prohibition on reporting medical debt to credit rating agencies. We think it's an important part because as we think of them as working together, sort of a retrospective relief of medical debt, and then a prospective prohibition on reporting the medical debt to the credit rating agencies. Now, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau under the Biden administration finalized a rule that would prohibit medical information from going to the credit rating agencies. But even with that rule, and it was implemented sort of in the final months, maybe even the final weeks of the Biden administration, we think it's wise to include that in this proposal because the CFPB is under attack as an organization, but certainly their rules will be under attack, particularly rules that were implemented close to the end of the Biden administration. So I think it's important to add that protection in our Vermont laws, even though the CFPB has put it in place at the federal level. And the reason for it, the rationale for it, which I think is important to call out, is medical debt is unlike other kinds of consumer debt. When you're thinking about buying a car or a home, you might take weeks or months to think about that decision. You might shop around for different prices. You might go to different financial institutions and figure out how to finance it. And then you make an affirmative decision about taking out the debt and purchasing the item. And that's why it's a good indicator of your creditworthiness. You're making this thoughtful decision. How thoughtful were you? How much debt did you take on? That was a deliberate decision. Are you keeping up with these intentional decisions that you made to go into debt? Medical debt, it's often a mental or physical health emergency that is happening to somebody. They don't have the opportunity to say, let me think about this, whether I want to engage in the treatment or not. They need the treatment. And then they don't have the ability to shop around on price. They're going to the healthcare provider that is closest to them to provide the services that they need. So it's not a great indicator of somebody's creditworthiness, whether or not they're paying back their medical debt. And that's why there's been this growing movement to exclude it from a credit reporting agency report.
There are states that look as though they've been using ARPA money to try to accomplish the same goal. Did Vermont make any effort to do that? COVID relief money, I guess I should call it.
Yeah, so the first government to sort of partner with this entity called Undue Medical Debt, which is the nonprofit that is working in this space to provide medical debt relief, was the Cook County, Illinois. And it was right during the middle of the pandemic when they thought about partnering with Undue Medical Debt. So ARPA money was freely available. I believe the state of Rhode Island was one of the more recent states to pass this proposal. So they're about 20 different governments from Cook County to Rhode Island. Rhode Island was one of the first not to use ARPA funds just because, at this point, ARPA funds are mostly committed. So here in Vermont, our ARPA funds are largely committed, and that's not what we're anticipating using to fund this program. But there's no magic to it being specifically from the federal government or from ARPA. Really, any source of funding to help facilitate the program is what's required.
You've talked about getting $1 million to pay down $100 million. Where would the $1 million come from?
Yeah, so our recommendation, I mean, really, we're agnostic as to where it comes from in a sense, but our recommendation is that it come from a source of funds that had been previously appropriated to our office. So about 4 years ago, we were appropriated $20 million to buy down state bonds on top of our normal financing and refinancing of our state debt. And over the last couple of years, we have issued debt. But when we go out to the market, we've been able to refinance some of our older debt and achieve pretty good savings. In the most recent year, we saved about $3.7 million by refinancing debt from 2014. The year before, it was about $1.3 million to refinance debt from 2013. So we've been able to achieve pretty good savings. And at the same time, this $20 million that we've been holding on to has been earning a pretty significant amount of interest. The interest rates are really high. We've been able to negotiate really high interest rates for ourselves when we, as a state of Vermont, put money in the bank account. So we have been sort of standing pat with that money. Now our suggestion is if we take $1 million of it, we think it would have a much bigger impact on Vermonters directly, being able to pay down $100 million of medical debt versus spending it to pay down our bonds would result in a one-time savings of about $50,000. So that's our suggestion. Of course, again, we're agnostic as to where it comes from, but this proposal would mean there's no new spending, certainly no taxes, no fees that are required to implement this program.
What's Vermont getting for interest rates these days?
Yeah, so at its peak, our negotiated agreement was about 5.25%, so pretty close to the federal funds rate. Now the interest rates have started to come down a bit, so I think we're at about 5%, but at the height it was about 5.25%, which is really really high when you think of it. I mean, we generated last fiscal year over $100 million of interest income from our office. 3 or 4 years ago, when you looked at that line item, it was like $700,000. So just to give you a sense of the scale, $700,000, $1 million generated from interest income up to $100 million a few years later.
Wow. Explain that to me.
Yeah, there's two factors. I mean, one is the interest rate, right? So maybe in 2019, we were earning less than 1%, a fraction of a percent. And then the other piece of it is how much money we have. Post-pandemic, we have $1.7 billion generally in our state's bank account on any given day. Now, that's not just in one bank account. It's in multiple, and we have treasury bills and other short-term investments that we purchase. But $1.7 billion of funds on a daily basis. Before the pandemic, that was $200 or $300 million. So much more money in our bank account, and we're getting a much higher rate across the board on our short-term investments.
Why is there so much more in the bank account?
I think there's a couple of reasons. One is just our economy is doing better. So our personal income tax, when you look at that number, what we've collected pre-pandemic, it was around $800 million. Now it's 1.2, 1.3 billion. So just on that one item alone, personal income has grown $400, $500 million pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. Some of that is wage inflation. Inflation has been going up. Some of that's the strong economy that the country has felt and Vermont has felt. And then some of that is folks moving to Vermont with higher incomes as well. I think all of those are reasons to account for that increase in the personal income tax. But, that one number means that our budget has grown. So the amount of money that's been appropriated but not yet spent, or has been collected by our office but not yet appropriated, as a result has gone up through the pandemic. And then the other big factor is federal money, like the ARPA money that you referenced earlier. I think there's still maybe about $500 million or $600 million of ARPA money that is being held by the state of Vermont, and that's being spent down, $10 or $20 million a month for the foreseeable future.
If you already have this money in the treasurer's office budget, do you need anybody's approval?
Yeah, we need the specific appropriation authority because it was appropriated for the purpose of buying down these bonds.
Got it.
So we're asking for the flexibility to use it also for this purpose. Now, we could end up spending less than $1 million on medical debt relief at the end of the day. I mean, it's an estimate that we've worked on with undue medical debt, but to have the flexibility to have $1 million to be able to provide and relief to the $100 million is sort of the focus.
How did you come up with this number? If you spend $1 million, that you can shoot for 100 million.
Yeah, it's quite, it's something that took me a while and a lot of due diligence to get comfortable with. But one of the first states we talked to is the state of Connecticut, and they said, this is an interesting program. Vermont should look into it. We were able to appropriate $6.5 million, and it's estimated that we're going to eliminate $650 million in medical debt. So I said, well, that's, that ratio is pretty significant. Can you sort of explain that to me? And it's really the fact that we're focused on older medical debt in the program. So it's medical debt that is 18 months to 7 years old. The fact it's older means its economic value is significantly reduced. And also the fact it's moderate and lower income individuals, the likelihood that it'll be paid back has gone down substantially. So you can buy it literally for a penny on the dollar. And I mentioned the 20 governmental groups that have partnered with this entity, Undo Medical Debt. So states, counties, cities, in each instance, their ratio that they're expecting or have started to see in terms of the purchase of medical debt is about 100 to 1. So that gave us confidence that that number is strong. And then that $100 million estimate really, again, came from Undo, looking at the overall amount of medical debt in Vermont and making an estimate about how many people would qualify for relief based on those income eligibility criteria.
What is who or what is the Undo Medical Debt? Is it a group? What is it?
Yeah, they're a pretty interesting group. It's a nonprofit. It was founded in 2014. It was founded by former debt collectors, so executives that did debt collection as a profession. They came together about a decade ago to create Undo Medical Debt. It used to be called RIP Medical Debt, but they rebranded, and now it's Undo Medical Debt.
Okay.
And they have a long track record of doing this work philanthropically across the country. So the government relationships that they've entered into the last few years is a somewhat new development in their sort of organizational model. But for the past decade, they've eliminated about $15 billion of medical debt for about 10 million Americans. And generally that has been from foundations that are donating to them, individuals that are donating to them. They got a significant donation from Mackenzie Scott in 2000, an $80 million donation to do their work. So they've been out in this field for a long time. They're sort of the premier nonprofit that does this kind of philanthropic debt relief. They have, like I mentioned, the history, the track record, the experience. So that gives us confidence when we're thinking about them as a partner with Vermont as well. So they're very reputable, again, a long track record across the country, and someone that we've enjoyed working with as we do the due diligence on this here in Vermont.
Mackenzie Scott, the ex-wife of Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Okay.
So she had
and she's given away, doing a lot of philanthropy.
Yeah, including here in Vermont, some organizations. But, they sort of have the practice of identifying organizations that they think are doing good work, and then they call and say they'd like to give money, and Undo Medical Debt was one of them. Something I wanted to mention about Undo, they have, through their philanthropic work, previously purchased medical debt of Vermonters. I don't know the full extent of the amount, but we do have testimonials from a couple of Vermonters who had their debt forgiven, and they're quite powerful. One Vermonter describes the fact that they were worried about making their payment on their debt. They were worried about it. They had a medical episode, and that they got the letter that the debt was forgiven, and it felt like angels from heaven, coming down and providing this information. Another person described the fact that they were having a mental health crisis and were forced to go into an ambulance to a hospital. Their insurance, they believe, charged them incorrectly in terms of the coding or the way they processed it, but that they were too sick to deal with the issue at the time. And then they just decided they weren't going to pay it. And they were worried about, when it was in collections, they were worried about its impact on them being able to buy a home. And then they got this letter that said their debt was relieved and that it was obviously very impactful for them. So it was great that Undo was able to provide us with a couple of Vermont testimonials that again gave us that flip side. Even though it's economically, the value of the debt economically has gone down significantly to that Vermonter. It's the full value of the debt as far as they know that they have to repay, and that's what's weighing on them, and that's what's impacting potentially their finances or also their health outcome choices. Like the social determinant of health is sort of this economic stability, and medical debt is one of those.
Yeah.
So if you have medical debt, you're less likely to seek medical care for fear
That's
of
for sure.
going into even more debt, or you're just have an element of shame, feeling like your provider is not going to want to see you or treat you because you owe them something. So that's an important part of the program.
And I know a lot of people go into bankruptcy as a result of this. How far can you stretch a medical debt before you have to go into bankruptcy?
Yeah, I mean, it's the number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States, medical debt, most broadly. So it's a real issue. I mean, it really depends on how much medical debt you have and what the hospital or the provider is willing to do in terms of working with you to forgive it, and then what kind of assets you have to be able to pay it off. So really, it's sort of all individually determined, but how aggressive the provider is, what your assets are. But this is the number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States.
All right, the $100 million question I have is, so why on earth would these people that are owed this money take a penny on the dollar?
Yeah, so it's that economic value of the medical debt at the point where we're buying it. So 18 months after the debt is owed, it's gone through the normal collections process at a hospital, more likely than not. And at that point, the likelihood someone's going to pay you back is just very low. And again, on top of that, that's for anybody. I mean, I think the that debt being repaid by anybody of any socioeconomic status is very low. But then you add on top of that the focus is on moderate and lower income individuals, people that aren't in a strong financial position to pay it back to begin with. You couple those two things together, and the value of it is really a penny on the dollar. That's what the likelihood of recovery would be if you sold it to a debt collector and then they went and tried to collect from all of the people that owe the money. Much earlier in the process, if it's only a month old and somebody's paying on their medical debt, then the value of it, the economic value of it, is almost the full amount of the debt because it's new debt. They've shown a propensity to pay on it. They're making progress toward paying it off. So that is a much more valuable kind of debt if you think of it in that way. But Undo has been able to focus on this sort of back end part of it, the debt that has gone through the collections process. Again, has little economic value to the provider, but it is sort of being felt in terms of the full face value of that debt on the individual Vermonter.
Okay, I hear you that I understand the economics, that if it's older debt, it's going to be worth less to the people that it's owed to, but a penny on the dollar just sounds really,
Yeah.
I mean, that seems very low.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I was surprised too. But, like I mentioned, both Undo's philanthropic work, where they have a decade-long track record of buying this kind of medical debt, and their relationships that they've entered into with governments have all proven out that that's sort of the rate that they're able to negotiate for providers. So they have a track record of delivering on that, and that gives us obviously confidence that they can do it here in Vermont.
All right, that almost sounds like debt that's uncollectible. So why help people with that kind of debt if it's pretty much gone, and I'm sure in some cases already written off?
Exactly right.
Why focus on that?
Or they don't, or the provider may not even be trying to collect it anymore at the point where we're purchasing it.
So why not just let that go and then focus on sort of the next couple of tiers of debt?
Yeah, well,
you understand what I'm asking?
100%. Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the things Undo does in terms of the program and its administration of the program, they work with the hospital and they negotiate a price. They purchase the medical debt. Sometimes the hospital will donate the medical debt at that point, so there actually isn't any, there isn't any dollars changing hands. We've also had conversations with Vermont hospitals about the possibility of, if money does change hands, maybe it would specifically be earmarked for patient assistance within the hospital, so just sort of further helps patients. So there's that part in terms of how it actually plays out. But in terms of, before we can get into the negotiations, we know that the economic value is probably $1 million. That's what we're asking for. But the other part is that the consumer doesn't know, the Vermonter that owes $25,000 and it's 2 years after they've had their medical incident, They just are thinking about how they owe that $25,000. They're worried about it. They have anxiety about it. Maybe they'd make some small payments on it. Maybe they're worried about, again, that medical debt, so they don't seek treatment with their provider. Maybe they don't seek credit because they know that they have this debt that they haven't paid. In some cases, it may be impacting their credit score as well. So to be able to provide a definitive elimination of that medical debt for that individual, allows them to sort of have this free and clear moment where they no longer have the anxiety and the worry. They're not being held back to seek medical care. They're not being held back to go seek credit, and it has that beneficial impact. And an important part of that process is that Undo works with our office, or would work with our office, to actually notify the individual that their debt has been forgiven. So it's that affirmative action of actually eliminating the debt and then notifying them that their debt has been forgiven, so that they react to that in the ways that I mentioned in terms of their behavior.
What's been the reaction? How extensively have you talked to people in the medical community or the medical collection community? Are they receptive to the idea of taking a penny on the dollar?
Yeah. So, because for two reasons. One is it's totally voluntary. Like, we need them to be interested in this program because they have to want to participate in the negotiation. And then it's also voluntary once it comes down to a negotiated price. They have to decide to accept the price. But so far, the conversations have been very good with the provider community, and there seems to be interest in providers participating in the program, including larger providers like here in UVM, participating in the program and also interested in selling their medical debt.
What if they come back to you and say, we'll take 5 cents on the dollar?
Yeah, well, I think it all comes down to the negotiation and the value. Undo has a long track record of negotiating with dozens, not even just dozens, hundreds really at this point, of hospitals across the country. So they know what the value is, and if they don't think, they're not going to want to overpay for it. And I hope that the hospitals here in Vermont similarly won't be trying to overpay. It's not designed to be a windfall for the hospital. It's designed to provide, some compensation, recognizing that there is some economic value, but also, they have to spend time and resources, negotiating into a confidentiality agreement, providing their debt files, going through their own sort of deliberative process about selling this. So it's recognizing that work and not trying to be a windfall to the hospital.
Where do you see the pressure point in this? Where's going to be the challenge in this?
Well, so far, I don't know if we have found one that we're able to overcome. I think explaining the concept is one of maybe the biggest challenges, why we're trying to get out and be active in explaining it to Vermonters, because it is a big number, and some people say that's great. Some people say, how can it be possible? And for the people that say, how can it be possible, we want to try to explain it to them so that they understand its benefits, and also that everybody understands that there's still people that are going to have medical debt even if this program comes into effect. Again, even if there is the prohibition on reporting to a credit reporting agency, the work that needs to be done to shore up the healthcare system in Vermont is far from over if this bill passes, but I do think it's a big step in the right direction.
So where does this stand with the legislature?
Yeah, so far so good in terms of the reception. We have co-sponsors on the Senate and on the House side. The chair of Senate Health and Welfare, Senator Ginny Lyons, is one of the lead sponsors in the Senate. Chair Ann Cummings, the chair of Finance, is the other lead sponsor in the Senate. This bill would have to go to both of those committees and then to Appropriations, so we feel really good that both of them are lead sponsors. On the House side, the lead sponsor is Chair Alyssa Black, who chairs the Healthcare Committee, and the other lead sponsor is the Vice Chair, who I believe is a Republican. So it's good to have that bipartisanship on the House side. But it's also bipartisan on the Senate side. There are 22 co-sponsors on the Senate, so that's out of 30 senators. 16 Democrats have co-sponsored it and 6 Republicans. And then on the House side, I believe the co-sponsor number is over 50 at this point, and again, a mixture of Democrats and Republicans. So that is great because, as Undo has done in other jurisdictions, and they have made the point publicly and continue to make the point publicly, they don't want this to be a partisan or political issue. It should be bipartisan, and so far that looks like what is happening here in Vermont. The estimate that Undue came up with was they thought that overall there was $155 million of medical debt for everyone, in Vermont that's below those levels that has medical debt, assuming that the provider's willing and interested in, participating in the program. But that's their estimate for how much debt is out there for those income eligibility levels. Like I mentioned, there'll still be medical debt that people will have that will be out there, and people will still be accumulating medical debt, but it is a big step to eliminate a vast sum of it for a wide number of people. We estimate about 60,000 Vermonters would be in that category, including the 100 million.
And you've had direct conversations with UVM about this. Obviously, they're the biggest provider.
Yeah, for sure. UVM, Health Network, and then also the Hospital Association for all the hospitals across the state. So we've had multiple meetings with all of them. They've had very productive conversations. They have some questions that technical questions that they're running out and running down, but we've had very good conversations with them.
What are people going to have to tell you in order to apply?
Well, that's the great thing about it, right? We said, I think, in the press release that we thought it was government at its best. And the reason we said that is because people that are going to be eligible don't have to do anything for this. There's no application process. So they will get a letter in the mail that says your debt has been eliminated. And the reason why I think that's so important is, we had a program. Now, there's tons of examples of this across government, but we had a program that we administered during the pandemic for hazard pay. So it was individuals that were working frontline jobs, that retail or hospitality, jobs that were deemed essential during those early weeks of the pandemic. And the legislature decided they wanted to provide basically a thank you to those frontline workers for putting themselves at risk during a period of uncertainty. And for those that were still employed with their employer, a year later after the pandemic, we just sent their employer basically the amount of money and they put it into their paychecks. But then there was a group of people that had left their job from the early days of the pandemic to about a year later when this program was in place. And, we, as a lot of people got assigned projects during the pandemic, we got assigned to this project of administering this program. And there were thousands of people that had left their jobs. And they said, well, for those people, they got to apply individually for the $2,000. So we said, okay. And we set up a program to do that, and we sent them letters, and we sent them emails, and then we texted, and then we called. And, even with our best efforts, we got about 65% of people to come and claim their $2,000. Our unclaimed property program that we run in the Treasurer's office, similarly, we can send people checks in the mail, which we do, and we have a program that we did in December. And even then, maybe 70 or 75% of the checks get cashed. So even the best program, it's hard to reach everyone for eligibility purposes. This program, there's nothing that you need to do to apply for. It will happen automatically. And the critical thing, though, is that you're notified that it has happened, because that's what would change your behavior.
Is there any danger the people that have a 9-month, 12-month debt are going to slow down their payments in order to try to get into this program?
Yeah, so the way that we've been framing it as a one-time program that will provide, eliminate medical debt for those that sort of are in this period right now. So there is a real question, if this was an ongoing program, would there be some sort of moral hazard that folks would not intentionally pay, to your point? So trying to make it clear that it's a one-time program for those that are in this category. Now, that's not to say if someone, by the time if it got stood up and it was a year from now and someone just got into that category, would they be excluded? I think probably not. But it's not generally a good practice to rely on something that still needs a lot of legislative approval, and the timing of it being stood up is a little bit uncertain. So it would be pretty clear, though, that it's a one-time forgiveness and for those that are in this eligibility criteria.
You just mentioned the term a couple of minutes back, government at its best. Boy, you hear that, it's reminds me of the government's here and we're here to help.
Yeah, right.
And what I guess I'm leading into on this is, we've seen an awful lot of activity in the past month here nationally, and impacts obviously here on Vermont. I know the Attorney General is doing a lot of work trying to push back on some of the changes that have been made. What are you watching as the state treasurer in terms of what's happening in Washington, D.C.? Are there any any efforts you're making to block anything? What are you keeping an eye on these days?
Yeah, there's a lot that is concerning to us. My experience during the first Trump administration when I was DFR commissioner was that there were times when stakeholders were really well engaged and coordinated and proactive, and I found that we were able to get ahead of some issues when that was the case. And there were at least a couple of examples where we were caught flat-footed just as a state when something changed quickly at the federal level.
Like what?
Well, I remember specifically there was a decision by the Care Board, the Green Mountain Care Board, is a number of years ago, to do something that was called a silver loading plan. It was something that every other state had done. We didn't do it for an extra year after every other state had done it, and it probably cost us 10 or 12 $1 million of federal subsidies for that 1 year. So if we had done it a year earlier, like a lot of other states, I think almost every other state had, then that would have been something that we could have protected in terms of that cost falling on Vermonters. In terms of the example of something that was good, there was another opportunity that the Trump administration took to undermine the ACA, called there were health association plans, I think is what the term was. So the idea was that you would siphon off people and businesses from the exchange into these association health plans. And they weren't a new concept, but they were something that existed before the ACA was around. So we were worried in Vermont, well, what are we going to do to, this is something that they're allowed to exist, but we're allowed to regulate them. So let's sort of fully regulate them to the extent that they would be any other plan. So there was really no incentive for them to be created. We weren't trying to do anything, that wasn't totally by the book from a regulatory standpoint, but we also wanted to make sure there was no perverse incentive to leave the ACA to go to association health plan, which overall would destabilize the healthcare market in Vermont. So I guess it's a long way of saying is that the group that was formed was this sort of healthcare group that would meet regularly, talk about these federal issues. And so it got me thinking in November we should have a task force at the Treasurer's office to help us think through these emerging issues as they develop from Washington, D.C. And we've been able to pull together about 8 different task force members, different areas of the economy, different areas of the state. We announced it in January, and we've been meeting regularly since the inauguration. The things that we're worried about, one of the biggest things you worry about is where is Vermont dependent on the federal government, and then where does the president have the most discretion, if you're trying to use those as 2 variables. Now, we're dependent on the federal government by a lot. 37% of our budget is federal funds, right? Funds that come to Vermont, and then we administer programs. Oftentimes it's programs that the federal government has told us we have to administer. So it's a little funny to think of them not sending those funds. But one of the big ones is Medicaid, something that's really critical for people in terms of health access. But 37% of our budget is from federal funds. So we're dependent broadly on the government. But one place where we're particularly reliant on them is natural disasters and natural disaster recovery. If you look at the last 15 years or so, Vermont is the 7th, not on a per capita basis, but on a total basis, tied for 7th in the country in terms of the number of major emergency declarations that have been issued. So we have a lot of natural disasters. And then if you look at the percentage of federal monies that have come in for recovery, it's something like $680 per Vermonter, and that ranks us 5th in the country in terms of a per capita number. So there's some states out there where the per resident number is like $20, right? So we're $680+. So we have, we don't make the headline in terms of a hurricane coming to Vermont or some sort of natural disaster that's causing billions and billions and tens of billions of dollars. But the flooding that we've experienced on a per capita basis is very expensive for our state. So that's an area where we're highly dependent on the federal government. And then you think about the fact that the president has a lot of discretion to declare a major disaster, a natural disaster or not. So that's a place that gives us concern. So we've been talking in this task force about the idea of reserving for natural disasters like we do for a rainy day fund with our budget. Is that a good idea? So in normal times, the reserve would be used for the 10% or whatever the percent FEMA match that's required. And in unnormal times, maybe it's used to sort of supplement or replace FEMA funding if it doesn't exist. So that's one major concern. Another concern is around tariffs. I mean, that is a real challenge for two reasons. One, there's a volatility and uncertainty piece to this whole conversation that's been happening in the last month. So businesses are getting prepared for there to be tariffs. They're changing their business practices. They're buying inventory, and then they don't happen. And that's sort of, obviously disruptive to a business. It creates uncertainty. When there's uncertainty in the marketplace, it's not good for the economy. People don't hire the person they're thinking about hiring. They don't make the investment they're thinking about investing. They just put their capital on the sideline and wait to see how things unfold. So there's sort of a broad concern around tariffs from an economic standpoint. But then specifically to Vermont, when they're talking about tariffs on Canada, they're our major trade partner. Of all of the imports that come into Vermont from international markets, like 67% are from Canada. It's our major importer. And then similarly, the things that we sell, Canada's our major purchaser of our products. So, some have argued maybe, is there any benefit to tariffs? I mean, it's hard to see there being any benefit to the consumer. One way or the other, prices are going up. Now, is there potentially a benefit to a manufacturer that's in the United States? Potentially, but for a lot of these products, there's not a manufacturer in the United States. They're in Canada, and that's where the supply chain is. So, but even if there is that sort of benefit to a Vermont-based business or to a United States-based business, the effect of the tariff is that prices go up. There's an artificial increase on the price of something that's imported. And if the price of something that's made domestically is lower, then the demand for that price is, people are going to flood to it, and the supply is not going to be able to keep up, and the price is going to go up. So either way, the likely outcome is that consumers are going to pay more. So that is a concern for us. And, how do you prepare for that? And I think it's really about advocacy to our federal partners, so they know specific examples about how Vermont businesses and individuals and industries are going to be impacted. They can put those questions to the Treasury, to the President, those kind of things. The other thing, two other things. One is that there's the federal funding freeze that we saw, right, where they attempted to just stop funds coming to under grants or to various governments, and that has been sort of reversed, and that's sort of on a temporary basis being not being allowed. But there's still examples that you see and you hear about in Vermont and across the country where the funding freeze was effectively still happening, even though they were ordered for it not to happen. And some of those are resolving over time, but they still have real impact. We heard from Common Good, which is an organization that represents nonprofits in Vermont. They had done a survey for the task force of the impact, and a number of nonprofits talked about how they were not hiring because of the funding freeze, or they had rescinded offers, or a couple of Head Start programs were on the verge of laying people off and not providing critical child care services because, I think they got notified that they had their money on Thursday, and they felt like they were going to have to execute on laying people off on Friday if it didn't come. So, really uncertain and challenging. But will those kind of things continue to happen over the next 4 years, that there'll be these funding gaps, funding freezes that we'll have to try to figure out ways to overcome? And then, of course, there was a story just this week about the federal government reaching in and clawing back money from the New York City comptroller. There was about $60 million of FEMA money that the government had sent to New York. It was authorized by Congress and had been with New York for about a week. And then the comptroller's team woke up one day and it was gone. And they had no notification from their bank. There was really no legitimate process where that money should have been pulled back. It was a ACH transfer that landed in their bank and had been there for over a week. If you make a mistake with those kind of transfers, there's a period of time to withdraw the money or notify the account holder that there's been a mistake. But none of that happened. It was just clawed back. And that's obviously concerning as well. So we've had conversations with our banks about what would this mean in Vermont? Could this happen? What protocols are in place to prevent it from happening? So a lot of stuff that's disruptive.
Uncertainty seems to be the real challenge here.
Exactly.
But you can actually have the federal government allocate money to somewhere in Vermont, and then they can take it back once it's already in the account of the Vermont entity, nonprofit, whatever it is?
I would have said no, but that appears to be what happened in New York City. And in New York City, it was the comptroller's bank account, so it would be the equivalent of our bank account in the treasurer's office, that we had gotten a deposit from the federal government, an ACA transfer from the federal government. Now, again, there's a period of time where you can reverse those because of an error or duplication or something.
Yeah, okay.
That's
like pending in our private
Yeah, so if
bank
you see that in your
accounts.
bank account, you might see that for 24 hours, right? This is like after that period has elapsed. It was days after that. And again, there was no notification. It was just they looked at their account and they saw a reversal, or it wasn't even a reversal. They just saw that $60,000 had come out of their account. So I would have said no, that's not something that you would think the government would be able to do. So I think there's still some analysis that has to be done about whether it was Citibank that reversed that transaction for the city, or whether the Treasury Department has some ability to go and grab those funds on their own. And either is concerning, but it'd be good to know what actually happened there.
Stay tuned, as they say.
Yeah, exactly right.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. Thanks for listening.